Hollywood Division Part 1, The Dream Factory at War, Los Angeles, 1942, the California air, usually scented with jasmine and ocean breeze, now smelled of dust and anxiety. The war seemed far away, but its echoes reached even here, into the heart of the American dream Hollywood. Film studios that had recently produced exclusively comedies, musicals, and westerns were now churning out training films and propaganda reels. But behind the high fences of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a project was being born that would surpass any script in its scope and audacity. The instigator was legendary director John Jack Warner, head of Warner Bros., who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, a man with the face of a bulldog and the energy of a hurricane. He saw war not only as a threat, but also as an opportunity to apply the magic of cinema not for entertainment, but to save lives. His idea was as simple as all genius. If Hollywood can make millions of people believe an actor is a superhero or a cowboy, why not make the enemy believe America has armies where there aren't any? His project was called the 18th Motion Picture Group of the Army Air Forces. On paper, it sounded boring. In reality, it was the most unusual military unit in history. Its soldiers included screenwriters, cameramen, makeup artists, stuntmen, and actors. Among those called up for service were future legends, the young and caustic photographer from Look magazine, Stanley Kubrick, who hadn't yet made a single film, but already saw the world through his lens with merciless clarity, and the king of Hollywood himself, Clark Gable, who, shocked by the death of his wife, Carol Lombard, in a plane crash, volunteered to take personal revenge. Their battlefield was the Mojave Desert in California. The vast, sun-baked expanses were a dead ringer for North Africa, where fierce battles with Rommel were raging at the time. Here, far from prying eyes, the Illusion Factory began its work. The chief director of this grandiose production was Captain George Thompson, a former stunt coordinator who knew everything about special effects. His right-hand man was Lieutenant Irving Ive Lehrman, a brilliant production designer capable of creating a German Tiger tank indistinguishable from the real thing out of plywood and papier mâché. Their task wasn't simply to make a movie. They had to create a reality that would be convincing to German intelligence. The very first project, Operation Sand Wraith, revealed the full scope of the undertaking. Intelligence reported that the Germans feared an Allied landing in southern France. The Hollywood Division's mission was to convince them that preparations for the landing were in full swing, but in a different location, to force the Wehrmacht to disperse its forces for this purpose. An entire phantom port was built in Mojave. Set designers erected fake piers and warehouses that looked realistic from the air. Landing craft were constructed from plywood and tarpaulins stretched over frames. From the air, on film, it looked absolutely realistic. But the main trick was the tanks. They can't just be mock-ups. Thompson insisted at the planning meeting, pointing a pointer at the drawing. German scouts aren't fools. They see tracks. They need movement. But they don't have engines. George Lehrman objected. Who said they have to drive themselves? The stuntmen found a solution. They adapted old Caterpillar tractors, disguising them as Willys cars. The tractor slowly crawled across the sand, pulling a lightweight plywood frame. Stylized as a Sherman tank, on a cable, the tracks left perfect, deep tracks in the sand. From the air, it looked like an entire tank column was moving across the desert. The shoe was hell. Temperatures soared above 50 degrees. The plywood tanks melted in the sun, the paint bubbling. The stuntmen operating the tractors worked in unbearable conditions. Stanley Kubrick, the designated cameraman, spent days on end in the stuffy, hot cabin of the truck from which they were filming. He experimented with angles, the way the light fell, the way dust rose from the tracks. He wasn't just looking for an image. He was looking for the truth. Even a lie, he believed, had to be flawlessly constructed. Clark Gable, despite his star status, meekly lugged boxes of equipment and played the officer on camera, giving his face the required expression, resolute and tired. For him, this wasn't a game. It was therapy. Every false shot, every pyrotechnic explosion was a step toward his illusory retribution. Asterisk when the footage was edited and shown to a group of high-ranking officers from Washington. They sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Damn it, one of the generals finally exhaled. I'd have believed it was Tunisia myself. The footage of the landing preparations was leaked to German intelligence. Through neutral countries, Abwehr agents confirmed that the Allies were concentrating their forces in the desert. Some German divisions were redeployed to a non-existent front. The first battle of the Hollywood division was won without a single shot being fired. They had proven that a camera can be more terrifying than a machine gun. But that was only the beginning. Ahead lay their most ambitious and dangerous production. Part 2. Shadow of the Caravan's success of Operation St. Ghost opened new, even more fantastical horizons for the Hollywood division. They now had access to real, decommissioned tanks, aircraft, and guns that could be destroyed on camera with maximum realism. Their workshops in Mojave became a veritable arsenal of illusions. Here, under the direction of Lieutenant Lehrman, Tiger tanks were crafted from wood and scrap metal that were indistinguishable from the real thing. From 500 yards away, here they devised ways to simulate shell explosions so as to create the right dust plumes, and how to simulate tank fires using special flammable mixtures that produce thick, black smoke. Their new mission became Operation Shadow of the Caravan. Intelligence intercepted German U-boats' plans to attack a large transatlantic convoy carrying tanks and aircraft to the USS or under Lend-Lease. Physically defending the convoy was impossible. The wolf packs were already in position. All that remained was to convince the Germans that the convoy had been destroyed, so they would stop hunting and allow the ships to reach port undisturbed. To achieve this, they needed to film documentary footage of the destruction of an entire convoy. Such an operation couldn't be carried out in the desert. They needed the sea. They were assigned a desolate stretch of coastline in Northern California, where the cliffs and harsh landscape resembled the North Atlantic. The scenario was terrifying. They had to film a large-scale battle, torpedo attacks on transports, fires, sinking ships, and sailors perishing in the oily water. All of this had to be done as authentically as possible, without any cuts, in a single take. As if filmed by a German reconnaissance officer from a U-boat periscope, Captain Thompson assembled a crew. "Guys, this is our Oscar. If we win, we'll never talk about it. But the Germans have to believe they're witnessing a real massacre." Several old, decommissioned freighters were used for filming, intended to serve as transports. They were rigged with pyrotechnics. The special effects team, under the direction of Kubrick, who strove for greater control over the process, developed a detonation system that created the illusion of a torpedo hit first a flash in the water, alongside the ship, then a gigantic column of water, and then the ship's slow, agonizing descent. The most difficult part was the people. The Germans had to see panicked sailors jumping overboard. For these shots, stuntmen and volunteers from among the filmmakers themselves were hired. They had to spend hours in the icy water, amid burning oil slicks and debris. Clark Gable, despite all attempts to persuade him to remain on shore, insisted on being in the frame. He donned the uniform of a common sailor and played one of the survivors of a sinking ship. When the old freighter Santa Elena, playing the role of the transport Sirius, began to sink after a series of controlled explosions, Gable, as planned, jumped overboard into the icy water. Cameras mounted on boats filmed his face close-up, contorted not by faint shock, but by genuine shock from the cold and adrenaline. This wasn't an acting feat, it was a true test. Kubrick, operating one of the cameras, filmed with an obsession that would later be called his signature style. He demanded retakes if an explosion wasn't convincing enough, if the smoke wasn't flowing properly, if the stuntmen weren't falling for real. He lay on the bow of the rocking boat, risking the water to capture the most dramatic angle of the ship's demise. For him, this wasn't propaganda. It was cinema, and it had to be perfect. After 3 days of filming, they had footage that chilled the blood. Burning ships, torn apart by internal explosions, people struggling with fire and water, oily slicks on the water, carcasses of sea creatures deliberately planted to simulate bodies. It was all edited into a 20-minute film, devoid of music, featuring only natural sound, the roar of fire, explosions, screams. It was secretly smuggled to Switzerland, where it fell into the hands of an Abwehr agent. The effect exceeded all expectations. German command, having studied the documentary footage, reported to Hitler the destruction of the Sirius convoy with enormous losses to the enemy. The hunt for the real convoy, which was peacefully sailing on its course at the time, was abandoned. The convoy safely reached Murmansk. The Hollywood division celebrated its most resounding victory. They saved dozens of ships and hundreds of lives without firing a single bullet. Clark Gable was nominated for an award, but refused to accept it. For him, the greatest reward was the knowledge that he had finally done something real. Stanley Kubrick received his first real lesson in directing. An image can be more powerful than reality itself, but their greatest triumph also concealed their greatest danger. They had become too good at their craft, and their art could easily turn against them. Part 3. The Last Shot, 1944. The war was slowly but surely drawing to a close. The Hollywood division was working itself to the bone, its illusions growing ever larger and more sophisticated. They created phantom airfields in England, whose taxiways looked real from the air, but on the ground were merely painted over. They filmed the preparations of fictitious divisions for the landing in Norway, using only a few dozen soldiers as extras, filmed repeatedly in different uniforms and from different angles. Their skill reached such a level that even their own officers sometimes couldn't distinguish their fakes from the real footage. It was precisely the success that gave rise to the greatest crisis in the division's history. Operation Chameleon was intended to be their swan song, a grandiose disinformation campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied attack after Normandy would come not on Germany, but through southern France and onto Austria. To achieve this, it was necessary to create the appearance of an entire tank army massing near Marseille. The script was written, and sets were built in Arizona, whose canyons resembled the foothills of the Alps, but this time, military censors, having reviewed the plans, vetoed it. The reason was shocking. The footage could be so convincing that, if it fell into German hands as planned, and then intercepted by Soviet intelligence, it could be perceived by the USSR as evidence of Western preparations for war against them. An illusion created to deceive the enemy could create a new, even more terrifying enemy in the form of an ally for the Hollywood division. This was a blow below the belt. They found themselves hostages of their own genius. Their weapons had become too dangerous for the world that was supposed to emerge after the war. It was at this moment that fate brought two very different men in the division together: Clark, Gable, and Stanley Kubrick. For Gable, for whom the war was personal revenge and redemption, the news of the operation's demise was the end of his entire career. He took to drink. He was seen sitting alone in a plywood Tiger tank, staring blankly into the desert. Kubrick, on the other hand, saw this as a new challenge. He approached Captain Thompson with an idea. "Sir, they're afraid our film is too real, so we need to make something that will be obvious as a film, but the enemy will still believe it." He proposed Operation Looking Glass. Instead of creating the illusion of strength, he proposed creating the illusion of weakness. The retreating Germans clung to any information that the Allies were also having problems. Kubrick proposed filming a secret chronicle that would prove that American Sherman tanks had a fatal defect in the transmission, causing widespread breakdowns and rendering them useless in the alpine terrain. It was a preemptive move. The Germans, having received this information, could have redeployed their anti-tank weapons to other parts of the front. Considering this direction less dangerous, the filming was brilliant in its cinematic cynicism. They took several serviceable Sherman tanks, and the mechanics artificially disabled them, overheating the engines, jamming the tracks. Kubrick shot close-ups of crazed mechanics, desperate officers, and documentary footage of the evacuation of disabled tanks. He used edits and deliberately amateur camera work to create the feeling of a secret information leak. All of this was shot with such an understanding of cinematic language that it seemed even more believable than their previous, impeccable productions. The leaked footage achieved its goal. The German command, already bitterly taught by the experience of relying on the Hollywood Chronicle, this time succumbed to its own paranoia. They considered information about the weak Shermans extremely valuable and adjusted their defenses. This was the last major operation of the Hollywood division. The war was ending. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The unit was disbanded. Its members returned to civilian life, signing a non-disclosure agreement. Clark Gable never fully recovered from his experiences. He returned to Hollywood, but the shadow of war always remained with him. Stanley Kubrick took the invaluable experience with him. His future films, such as Dr. Strangelove and Full Metal Jacket, would be permeated with the themes of the absurdity of war and the power of illusion lessons learned in the dusty Mojave Desert. The legacy of the Hollywood division lives on. Many of their images, filmed as disinformation, have circulated for decades in documentaries as authentic newsreels. They blurred the line between truth and fiction, proving that in an information war, it's not the one with the most guns who wins, but the one with the best script and the most compelling director. They were soldiers whose weapon was the light of a film projector, and their battles, though staged, saved countless real lives, remaining one of the most incredible and carefully concealed chapters of World War II.